Hi guys, and welcome to the first ever episode of AniMagma. I'm SolsetLava, and hopefully this is where I'll have a chance to talk about and discuss classic old school anime. Hayao Miyazaki, a world-renowned animation director and co-founder of the much-acclaimed animation company Studio Ghibli, recently celebrated his 76th birthday, so a very happy birthday to Mr. Miyazaki and hopefully many more. But that isn't the only thing to celebrate, as it turns out that 2017 is also the 20th anniversary of one of his all-time classic animated films, Princess Mononoke, originally known as Mononoke Hime, which roughly translates to Spirit or Monster Princess. Although the film originally released in 1997 in Japan, it didn't actually come to the United States until 1999. At the time, we still hadn't gotten a lot of Studio Ghibli films here in the United States, in part due to an early poor experience that the studio had with an American multimedia company called New World Pictures. Way back in 1985, New World Pictures licensed and released what's often considered Studio Ghibli's first animated feature film, known as Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Unfortunately, they felt compelled to change the movie in order to better appeal to American audiences, and what we wound up with was a heavily edited and basically butchered version of the movie, released under the title Warriors of the Wind. So this became this. Youch. When Hayao Miyazaki found out about all those changes, he was understandably upset, and from that point forward, the studio adopted a no-edits policy for all of their films, which unfortunately made it more difficult for their movies to see a release in the United States. After that, we were only able to get a few other Studio Ghibli movies, including Grave of the Fireflies, which was released by Central Park Media, and also My Neighbor Totoro, released by 20th Century Fox. Fortunately, towards the end of the 90s, the Walt Disney Company was able to finally start properly releasing the studio's backlog of films, starting with Kiki's Delivery Service in 1997, and then eventually Princess Mononoke in 1999. The stateside debut of Princess Mononoke back in 1999 was pretty exciting because they were really going all out with the release. It was being handled by Miramax at the time, which was kind of a mature Disney subsidiary, and they specifically hired recognized actors and actresses for the English dub to help attract attention to the film's release. Some of the voice talent included Gillian Anderson, Billy Crudup, Claire Danes, Minnie Driver, Jada Pinkett Smith, and Billy Bob Thornton, so it gave fans like me the impression that they really wanted to try and do the film justice and give it a worthwhile release. To top it all off, they also decided to have a limited theatrical run of the film, which I was actually able to attend way back in 1999. It's kind of difficult for me to believe it's almost been 20 years since I first saw the movie in theaters, wide-eyed and excited to see another Miyazaki masterpiece, and on the big screen to boot. It was a really cool time to be an anime fan. Unfortunately for me though, I admittedly wasn't quite ready for the movie that I wound up watching. I was a young kid at the time, very early into my anime fandom, and the only Miyazaki films I had seen up till that point were Kiki's Delivery Service and My Neighbor Totoro, which were more charming, family-friendly sorts of films. I was expecting more of a popcorn action-adventure flick, and was very surprised by the much more serious tone of the film, as well as some of the dark imagery and graphic violence it displayed. The dub also had some particular issues of its own that I'll get into in a bit, but I wound up leaving the theater with mixed feelings and an impression that I should have liked the movie more than I did. Flash forward 20-some years into the future, and it just so happens that this past week, in order to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Princess Mononoke's Japanese release, they decided to do another limited theatrical run of the movie here in theaters, this time with subtitles. After all these years, I was actually excited to finally go see it again, not just to see if my opinion would be improved by seeing the Japanese language version for the first time, but also to see if 20 years of growing up would affect my interpretation of the film. Unfortunately though, the theater I went to somehow goofed things up and wound up playing the dub version of the film, which surprised me along with a lot of the other disappointed members of the audience. Despite that, it was still a great opportunity for me to at least see if maturing over the course of 20 years would change my opinion on the film, and just to make sure I could put a period mark on the whole thing, the very next day I decided to finally watch the subtitled version of the movie on the DVD that you see right here. Now before I talk about the movie, I did want to mention a little bit about some of my experience in the theater. It was pretty exciting to see a broad range of anime fandom there, not just younger fans looking to watch the movie for the first time, but also a lot of parents maybe hoping to expose their kids to a movie they might have also watched years ago when they were young themselves. It was pretty heartwarming to see. prior to the start of the movie was also another surprise. They decided to play a classic 90s music video that was animated by Studio Ghibli for the song On Your Mark by the pop duo musical group Chage and Asuka. It was actually pretty breathtaking to watch it on the big screen, and it really hit the nostalgia button for me, not just because it had been such a long time since I last heard the song, and I admittedly was singing along in the theater. That song is great. But also because the animation itself had so many visual and thematic sci-fi elements that were really popular back in the 80s and early 90s that it was really cool to see again after such a long time. Anyways, let's get to talking about the movie itself. Princess Mononoke takes place in ancient Japan at a time when gods and spirits are still said to roam the earth. The story revolves around the journey of a young man named Prince Ashitaka who lives in a reclusive village in eastern Japan. A giant boar god, seemingly changed into a demon, is rampaging in the forests near Ashitaka's village. Its blind fury seems like it might pose a threat to the village, and Ashitaka tries in vain to calm the god's angered spirit. When the boar god lunges in the direction of some of the village children, Ashitaka is forced to take up his bow and arrow and ultimately slay the raging god. Unfortunately, this confrontation comes at a steep cost, as Ashitaka is wounded, marked with a cursed scar that he's told will eventually seep into his bones and kill him. Interestingly, the townspeople are actually very in tune with nature and the spirits of the world, and the village elder apologizes to the dying boar god, promising that they'll erect a shrine in its honor. Unfortunately for Prince Ashitaka though, due to village customs, the slaying of the boar god means that he has to leave the village never to return. Although the village elders do suggest that he may be able to lift the curse on his arm if he can find out what caused the boar god to become enraged in the first place. Prince Ashitaka then sets out on a quest to learn about what's angered the gods, along with the dire events that might be happening in the world outside his village. The plot is a bit complicated to explain fully from that point, since there are a lot of different characters with varying motivations throughout the course of the film and a few intersecting plot lines, but essentially, Prince Ashitaka finds that there is a lot of conflict happening amongst the humans and the gods. In particular, he learns about two specific groups that are fighting each other. On the one side is Lady Aboshi, the leader of a firearms-producing miniature fortress lying at the outskirts of a forest where they mine for the iron used to produce their weaponry. On the other side is Princess Mononoke, a young girl who was raised by the wolf gods of the forest and is seeking vengeance against Lady Aboshi for killing the forest spirits and destroying her homeland. Ashitaka learns that Lady Aboshi is responsible for the boar god's rage at the beginning of the movie, having shot him herself with a rifle in order to gain easier access to the forest. From that point on, the film revolves around Prince Ashitaka's struggle to try and bridge the gap between the human and spiritual worlds and hopefully bring peace to both. One thing I wanted to mention, it's interesting that the movie is called Princess Mononoke when she's actually a bit more of a side character, in that the movie really focuses largely around Prince Ashitaka and his story, and not so much on Princess Mononoke. Anyways, having finally watched the movie after all these years again, once in English and finally in Japanese, I can safely say that I consider it to be a great movie, and certainly worthy of the critical acclaim it's garnered for all of these years, particularly the Japanese language version, which is fantastic. First, I'll get into what I liked about the movie, and then I'll get to a few points that I found to be a bit detracting. As expected from a Studio Ghibli film, Princess Mononoke has incredibly gorgeous animation that still stands up amazingly well even today. I did recently watch The Wind Rises, a Hayao Miyazaki film that released just a few years ago, I think, and while the animation in Princess Mononoke isn't quite as lavishly produced, it's still incredible to watch and see, and is beautifully directed and composed throughout, with stunning backgrounds and settings that really bring the story to life. As an adult, one of the things I liked about the movie that didn't quite occur to me as a kid was the way that it tries to help viewers sympathize with not just the animal gods of nature and their struggle to defend themselves against humanity's industrial progress, but also with the humans in the movie and their motivations to survive in a seemingly cruel and difficult world. Lady Aboshi isn't just destroying the forests out of greed. A big part of her motivation is to help a lot of destitute and suffering people who would otherwise be living under unbearable conditions. She goes out of her way to buy up the contracts of women working in brothels so that they can instead work for her at her fortress. She also takes in people suffering from leprosy, which is a debilitating skin condition, and offers them a home and work life in a world that would otherwise shun them. I guess I can appreciate that the movie has a certain moral grayness to it and doesn't paint either side in black and white terms. I also like that Prince Ashitaka is this excellent catalyst for change between those two groups, since he comes from a way of life where humans and nature already live together in a certain degree of harmony. It's that sort of middle ground perspective that helps prevent the movie from coming across as overly preachy and grounds the movie in a way that makes the message that much more identifiable. The Japanese version of the film, I think, is the quintessential viewing experience, not just because it's much more immersive given the ancient Japanese setting, but also because the performances are much more subtle and wind up making many of the characters in the movie a bit ways more likable and grounded when compared to the English dub. This isn't to say that the English dub is bad, since I actually think it's surprisingly good, with performances that in some ways help to elevate the movie by giving a bit more emotion and scale to the story that maybe isn't as present in the Japanese version. That said, there are a few problems I had with the movie actually stemming from both language versions. The grounding subtlety of the Japanese performance, I think, unfortunately in some ways comes across a little monotone over the course of the movie, which maybe makes it a little bit less exciting than the English version. And while the English version is more emotional overall, that extra emotion sometimes makes the tone of certain scenes come across as borderline preachy, and other times makes serious moments unintentionally humorous. Although I really like the story overall, and as an adult I'm not at all fazed anymore by some of the dark imagery and violence in the film, surprisingly I would say that the ending of the movie maybe felt a bit too safe, and more in the vein of a traditional action movie, when maybe they could have gone down a more dramatic route and really doubled down on the serious tone that the movie had overall. That said, I do appreciate the more hopeful tone of the ending, and the sense that despite our problems with nature, we always have a chance to make things right. The last thing I wanted to mention as an interesting related anecdote, the theater that I recently watched the 20th anniversary screening at was actually located in a previously undeveloped area of the city that I live in. As I left the movie theater, it struck me that I remembered how the surrounding area used to be heavily forested, and I was reminded how in recent years, heavy development in the city outskirts had been displacing a lot of the local wildlife. The movie-going experience made me more aware of humanity's continuing encroachment into nature in my own city, and I think a movie that can make you conscientious about your relation to the real world around you, that's definitely something to write home about. And that's all for now. Were you able to watch the movie in theaters? What was your first experience watching Princess Mononoke? Feel free to comment below. Otherwise spoken, I hope you enjoyed this episode of AniMagma, and if you liked this episode, feel free to hit that like button, and if you really like this episode and haven't done so already, feel free to hit that subscribe button too. That's all for now. You guys take care. I hope you all have a good one, and I'll talk to you later. Ciao.